What's up, guys? Today we're talking about what is supposed to be the final playtest for Unreal 5 coming to Squad. And we're going to recap some of my experience in this playtest. So hit the subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below with any thoughts you have on the playtest. And don't forget, if you want 30% off of Squad, you can use my code SLATE3K30 in the link in the description for yourself or to gift a key to a friend. So generally the game or playtest performance was all right. There was only some issues where the frame rate would drop, for example, on Sanctioned Islands. Venturing to the Southern Islands, I saw a significant frame drop of like 15 or so frames for a brief period of time before it kind of went back up to its 60 to 70. And that seemed to be the story for most of my playtests. I was sitting around 60 to 70 frames, if not a little bit higher than that, with the exception of when I went to scope in or ADS. That typically resulted in a drop of about 12 to 15 frames, let's say on average. So during gameplay, if I'm sitting around 60 to 65 frames, I might be looking at a frame rate closer to 50 when I ADS. Now, to some extent, ADSing didn't feel as problematic as it has in the past. I don't know if that's necessarily because the frames are better or just the system in place is a little bit smoother. However, it wasn't as smooth as I hope it may get. Now, if you did read the notice for the playtest, this is an area that they are still working on, and Norby had a post about what was going on, that this is a new implementation for the picture-in-picture scopes. So from what I've heard around, it seems like folks have seen some improvement here, but there still is some hitching as the scope gets pulled up. And again, the frame rate isn't great because sometimes if I'm ADSing and the frame rate drops below 50, it starts to get noticeable, especially when you're pulling up your scope. Now, to some extent, this exists within Unreal 4. It's not just specific to Unreal 5, but I really want this to be a smoother experience in Unreal 5. And from someone who has played the closed playtest, there has been progress made here. But overall, it still feels sluggish. And I noticed with the G3, this was just kind of an interesting experience. With the pace of the ADS and the slight screen flicker, because it appears that they're really making changes to the outside peripheral vision, cumulatively, it just became a little bit distracting. Now, I think there's more to discuss with ADSing and general performance as two columns that we should talk about, but I think we should just cover a little bit of the general playability of the playtest. Something I've been looking for is to see if the Unreal 5 version of Squad plays better than the Unreal 4 version of Squad. And frankly, through closed playtest and open playtest, there have been moments. There have been moments where Unreal 5 really stands out as something that is better or just plays better than Unreal 4 version of Squad. And much of this echoes what Norby said from Offworld in my video about Unreal 5 before open playtesting had begun. You're looking for the experience in Unreal 5 to become better, or at least on par with what you have in Unreal 4. And like I said, I've had moments where the Unreal 5 version of Squad does exceed the expectation that I have for a playtest. A lot of that's because we have the reduced hitching. Like, the game isn't stuttering all of the time. There does seem to be moments where maybe there's a server side slowdown or something may be going on. But generally, I'm not having some of the hitching issues I have in Unreal 4. And while I'm not getting 100 frames per second, I do feel like the frame rate is more consistent for the most part. What I mean is, if I'm saying that I'm sitting around 60 to maybe 70 frames, it typically stays there, again, with the exception of ADS, but it doesn't bounce around as much as I've seen sometimes in Unreal 4. Now, not everyone is in agreement that this is a better playable version of Squad, that being Unreal 5, but I've seen more comments leaning in that direction. However, there is something more distracting about the playtests, and that is bugs. And if we're going to talk about the general gameplay or sort of my experience with it, I have to mention this because there were a lot of bugs. Now, one thing that I don't think everyone may be aware of, because I saw some comments referencing similar things that I saw initially, was to make sure you clear your cache. Because when I started playing the playtest, I was missing sounds. For example, the MK19 grenade launcher had no audio attached to it, nor did the automatic version of the rifle I was using in the first round that I played. But this wasn't necessarily a bug as much as it was just clearing the cache, because upon doing that, everything returned to normal. I also know that someone else was having some issues. They verified game files, and that actually fixed a couple of the problems they were having, along with clearing their cache. So if you were noticing some similar issues, that might have been remedied by clearing cache or verifying game files. But besides some of the things I've already talked about, the most distracting element of the playtest was certainly some of the bugs I ran into, because they were prominent enough over 3 to 4 hours of playtime just on Saturday that I constantly found these little things to be distracting from the immersion that I was hoping to get. Because while Unreal 5 is certainly eye candy from a lighting perspective, it looks great. Scorpo was really cool to play and have all the mountains sort of visible and kind of more in focus because of the lack of visual fog. It was bogged down by the fact that certain things were just happening and distracting from just doing whatever task I was setting out to do while playing. One of the most distracting or disorienting bugs I had was spawning on a hab or getting revived by a medic and teleporting briefly to a different place that could be 100 meters away, running in place there, and then jumping back into the character that I was planning on playing as. There was one time where I got revived. I ran 100 meters or so, maybe 200 meters away. Someone told me that my body was still on the ground, and then I actually teleported back to that body and had to rerun the route I had just run. There was other people probably experiencing this because I did actually see people running in place in different spots, but I only noticed that once or twice compared to how many times I was just teleported myself. I noticed that not all textures were rendering in right away when I would spawn. Also, explosions appeared to be not fully rendered in at times. Maybe one of the most distracting things is how audio was shifting from right side to left side, sometimes centered, regardless of how you positioned your audio on the meters within your settings. That's one of those things that's borderline headache-inducing, distracting, disorienting, kind of all of the above, unfortunately. There were other things that were noticeable. For example, in Mutaha, we noticed that some of the roads seemed to have like an invisible layer elevated above that acted almost like a wall for infantry, but you could climb on them or you could go beneath them. And of course, the list goes on, especially as more people had played and found more things. I saw more, including the fact that on Sanction, when we went to go get on the boats, there were no docks there. The point of me sharing this is to help explain that this was the more distracting part of the gameplay, was just bugs or little issues that began to stack up. Now, some of these issues weren't as small, like the audio thing was really problematic. My hope is that maybe this is a slightly older build that doesn't have all these things fixed. It did seem like Offworld was keeping track of some of the bugs that I saw reported in the Playtest Discord, as if they were already aware and maybe those things were in progress to be fixed. Along with some frame rate drops specific to ADSing, this is the biggest area of concern, is just the number of bugs that we're finding with Unreal 5, which is to some extent expected. But the concern comes in when you start labeling it as the final playtest and you're still running into these issues. And I don't mean that you shouldn't expect any bugs, there will certainly always be some. My concern is that once 9.0 releases, you are going to have older players coming back to the game and maybe newer players joining in. Especially for those newer players taking a chance on squad, these things can start to add up pretty quickly. They're not always going to have the patience that some folks would have when they're diving in for the first couple of hours. Now, do I think Unreal 5 has surpassed or is on par with Unreal 4? I think it's pretty close in terms of the performance and general gameplay, but I do think the bugs are pretty distracting. The ADS still needs some work, although I do know that is an area of focus for Offworld. But I also wanted to note something that struck me, especially when playing Goro, is that it feels almost like a completely new map due to some of the texture changes and the lighting. Also played an Albaza round that took place in the airport area that was a skirmish layer that was a ton of fun for a tight, close quarters infantry fight. Obviously, with my last video, I told you guys that I felt like this opportunity to update the engine is necessary, and it still is. But I do think we're running into some of the growing pains or aspects of UE5 that still need work, and I'm hoping that this can continue to get polished before release. Because I do think there's actually a really high ceiling for what squad can be in Unreal 5 in the long term. So as always, let me know your thoughts on the playtest down below. Did you see better performance or kind of the same? Did you notice a lot of bugs as well? Hit the subscribe button so you can be up to date on all things related to this update. And of course, like the video, and I'll catch you next time.